My dear students and viewers, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to my online class. I am Murshida Imam, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Govt Shahid, Suhrawardy College, Dhaka. Today I am here for the students of Honours 3rd Year, Department of English. My dear students, how are you? Hope you are fine and doing your online classes regularly. My dear students, in the continuation of our previous class, today we will read we'll start from para 27 of the criticism, that is of the critical theory, Preface to the Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth. Hope you are ready to do the class. Yes, you are ready? Then let's start. At first, I want to focus on the main points of para 27 to 34. The main points of those paras are like that. Here the poet may be criticized. Wordsworth is saying that the poet may be criticized for its choice of simple themes and for the use of simple language, but Wordsworth is not going to make any alteration to please some readers. His feelings are his stay and support, or the sentiments elevate language. And Wordsworth cautions the readers against false criticism. They should judge him on the basis of their feelings and not be carried away by the views of critics. The difference in good and bad poetry is not due to meter, language, or order of words, but it is due to the feeling which arises out of thought. His poetry is entirely different from traditional poetry, but if it succeeds in pleasing the people, it would lead to the production of a new species of poetry, which would have a permanent value and give a higher pleasure. Warning against false criticism is to be noted here. That is, Wordsworth comes to the faults which critics might find in his poems. He may be charged with dealing with unworthy subjects, or he may be accused of making an arbitrary connection of ideas and feelings with particular words and phrases. But Wordsworth would not make any alteration to please such critics, because he himself did not feel that he had been arbitrary. He would not be modifying his language, as that would mean going contrary to his feelings. For a poet, his own feelings are his support and stay. Wordsworth is saying that for a poet, his own feelings are his support and stay. He would not alter anything, for once the alteration started, there would be no end to it. Further, alteration at the instance of critics would show a lack of self-confidence. So what matters in poetry? That is, what matters in poetry is the feeling and not the language. Wordsworth compares a stanza from Dr. Johnson's poem with a passage from a well-known ballad, Babes in the Wood. Here you can see on your textbook the stanza, and the latter, according to Wordsworth, is poetry because it embodies noble feeling. The former embodies no deep feeling. That is, if I want to quote those lines for you, it will be like that. The stanza from Dr. Johnson, that is, I put my hat upon my head and walked into the street, and there I met another man whose hat was in his hand. And immediately after these lines, Wordsworth saying that let us place one of the most justly admired stanzas of the Babes in the Wood. That is, these pretty babes with hand in hand went wandering up and down, but never more they saw the man approaching from the town. In both these stanzas, the words and the order of the words in no respect differ from the most unimpassioned conversation. So, Wordsworth is saying that the former, that is the first stanza which I have read for you, the former embodies no deep feeling, but the latter, according to Wordsworth, is poetry because it embodies noble feeling. And that is the difference between the two stanzas. Even though there is a little difference in order in words or the order of words. Wordsworth requests the reader to judge poems on the basis of his own feelings and not to go by the words of critics. Okay, so I am repeating the line for you. That is Wordsworth request. What does Wordsworth request the reader? That is, the answer will be like that. Wordsworth requests the reader to judge poems on the basis of his own feelings and not to go by the words of critics. Okay, and Wordsworth further warns the reader against coming to a rash and hasty decision. One should reconsider the works of a poet if it does not impress one at the first reading, especially if the poet had earlier impressed one. An accurate taste in poetry is an acquired talent required only by continuous and strenuous acquaintance with the best works of art. The reader had been used to another type of poetry. For getting a new type of pleasure, the reader should peruse these poems with an open mind. If his purpose of imparting pleasure through his poetry is fulfilled, a species of poetry would be evolved, which is genuine poetry. It would be suited to the interest of mankind permanently and important in the multiplicity and quantity of its moral relations. So, the preface ends with a fresh plea to the readers to read his poems with an open mind and to judge for themselves if what the poet had set out to achieve had been achieved and whether it was worth being attained. Okay, and that's all about the preface to the Lyrical Ballads 1802 of Wordsworth. And in our next class, my dear student, we will read Appendix on Poetic Diction 1802. Okay, and now I want to discuss a very important topic, that is Wordsworth's conception of the poet, his qualifications and function according to Preface to the Lyrical Ballads 1802. Wordsworth's conception of a poet, his qualifications and function are propounded in detail in his Preface to the Lyrical Ballads 1802. His concept also revolts against the 18th century glorification of a poet as somebody separate and different from other human beings. Wordsworth's views are governed by a keen desire of bringing to poetry a democratic essence. He aimed at humanizing poetry to bring it close to humanity. His idea of a poet is likewise a step towards democratization. Okay, democratization. What is democratization? Okay, fine. His idea of a poet is likewise a step towards democratization. Okay, what is interesting is that he also insists on the individuality of the poet while asserting that he is close to humanity. What is a poet? Wordsworth's answer is, he is a man speaking to men. We are struck immediately by the fact that the poet's main function is that of communication. He is a man writing not merely for his own pleasure, but in order to share his thoughts and feelings with an audience or with his readers. The social implications of a poet's function is thus quite clear. A poet speaks to whom, my dear students? Yes, a poet speaks to men. He has to speak in such a way as to make his thoughts and feelings intelligible to his readers. It becomes necessary for him to use a language free of quaint tricks and hieroglyphics and enigmas. He must descend from his superior heights where he does not belong anyway and adopt the real language of men for his communication. The poet seeks to enlighten the readers about the universal and basic truths of human nature. He has to do so in a language which is easily intelligible to mankind in general. Okay, and while Wordsworth is fully conscious of the individuality of the poet who works of his own volitions, he is equally concerned with emphasizing in the preface that a poet is closely connected with humanity. He is aware of the oneness of nature, man, and other forms of life, and his business is to communicate this knowledge. Okay, so according to Wordsworth, what is a poet? We have learned it here. Okay, and now qualifications of a poet. The poet is different from other human beings, not in kind but in the degree to which he possesses certain qualities. At the very outset, Wordsworth emphasizes that the distinction between a poet and other people is only a matter of degree and not the basic qualities. Okay, and the poet is a man possessed of a higher sensibility than others. A more lively sensibility helps him to react more powerfully to external impressions. As a result, his passions and emotions are more intense. He is able to observe more than others can, hear more than they do, and feel more deeply than they can. His sensibility is closely bound up with moral nature. It enables the sense impressions which he receives to be purified and exalted through imagination. The poet's imaginative power is much greater than average human beings, and it enables to enlarge his scope of emotion and feeling. He can experience in his imagination. Okay, the poet can experience in his imagination. He can feel and respond to emotions which he has not directly experienced. Imagination helps him to do so. He is affected by absent things as if they were present. Okay, it's quoted from Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. That is, the poet is affected by absent things as if they were present. The poet has more comprehensive soul. He shares the feelings and emotional reactions of other people acutely. He has the capacity of identifying himself with others in an emotional bond. He can thus express those emotions even if he has not felt them directly. He has a deep knowledge of human nature. He understands their passions and feelings better even if he has not gone through them himself. So, my dear students, you see, the poet's enthusiasm is more intense and keen. He enjoys every aspect of life with a sharper sense of involvement. He takes deep pleasure in the knowledge of the oneness of nature and man. Having realized this basic truth about nature, he feels keen pleasure. He seeks to communicate his joy to his readers. While stressing on the poet's sensibility, Wordsworth is never blind to the necessity of thought. Poetry is basically concerned with the expression of powerful feelings. At the same time, it originates in emotion collected in tranquility. And it is clear that thought and contemplation modify the original immediate emotion. Reflection purifies the original emotion of all that is accidental and superfluous. It is through thought that a poet can associate various images and feelings and arrive at universal truths from particular phenomena. A poet is thus not only a man who has a lively sensibility, but one who has thought long and deeply. The poet then possesses the faculties of observation, sensibility, reflection, imagination, fancy, and judgment. Wordsworth later added that a poet should possess sincerity as well. By sincerity, he meant that the poet should take pains to revise his work so as to achieve artistic clarity. He should make efforts to express himself in unambiguous terms. Thus, Wordsworth was not wholly blind to the need of artistic finish. He did not favor artistic carelessness. And now I want to discuss individualism of the poet. Okay, At first glance, it seems surprising that a poet's individuality and freedom is insisted upon, even while he is being made a man speaking to men. But Wordsworth does indicate that there is a certain amount of difference between a poet and other men, in degree if not in kind. And if we notice, we find that the difference of degree is quite wide. A poet's individuality and independence is stressed. He does not write under duress. He does not write because somebody compels him. He writes of his own volition. He writes of his own will. When the mood or inspiration is upon him, and he is the law unto himself, pleased with his own volitions. He does not need any other justification for his work except his own feelings, which are his rock of defense. They are his stay and support. He does not require the support of anyone else's willpower. And all said and done, one wonders if Wordsworth's poet could really be the ordinary man. The difference in degree between the poet and other men seems quite awe-inspiring. However, it is this sense of individualism which makes the poet of Wordsworth's conception different from the social poet of other ages. In the preface, Wordsworth states that the end of poetry is to produce excitement in coexistence with an overbalance of pleasure. For the first time after the neoclassical bias towards didacticism, a poet states the end of poetry to be pleasure. Wordsworth's pleasure, however, is not mere trivial delight or idle amusement. His very conception of pleasure includes noble moral ideas. His conception of pleasure includes what? Noble moral ideas. It is not a temporary and trivial pleasure which poetry aims at. There are delightful accessories in poetry, such as rhyme, meter, and such other external aids. But the true pleasure of poetry lies in something higher. True poetic pleasure incorporates a realization of basic universal truths which serve to enlighten, strengthen, and purify our emotions. Poetry's pleasure involves the purification and exaltation of the very souls of the readers. Poetry enlightens understanding. It did not mean that the poet is a conscious didactic writer, writing with a firm purpose before his eyes. Wordsworth explains his own experience. He did not begin to write with a distinct purpose formally conceived, but habits of meditation had so prompted and regulated his feelings that his description of such objects as strongly excite those feelings will be found to carry along with them a purpose. And his poetry, claimed Wordsworth, was aimed to console the afflicted, to add sunshine to daylight by making the happy happier, to teach the young and the gracious of every age to see, to think, and to feel, and therefore to become more actively and securely virtuous. So here we see the poet plays the role of a teacher, a moral teacher. He expressed his view in a letter that every great poet is a teacher. Every great poet is a teacher. I wish either to be considered as a teacher or as nothing. My students, Wordsworth expressed these views, this view in a letter, which he wrote, that is, every great poet is a teacher. I wish either to be considered as a teacher or as nothing. So Wordsworth wanted to be considered as a teacher or as nothing. But he never forgets that pleasure is an essential condition of poetic teaching. In this, as critics have remarked, he is close to the doctrine of Horace. He wanted and hoped that his poems would cooperate with the benign tendencies in human nature and society, and will in their degree be efficacious in making men wiser, better, and happier. It is through relationship and love that poetry can exert benign influence, and the medium of teaching is through feelings rather than the intellect. The medium of teaching is what? Through feelings rather than the intellect. Here is where his educative view of poetry differs from that of the new classicals. Okay, here is the difference. Okay, and so you see, Wordsworth's conception of poetry was a high one, and he called it the most philosophical of all writings, the breath and final spirit of all knowledge, the image of man and nature. Okay, in this way he glorifies poetry. The poetry naturally has an exalted and difficult task to perform. He has to communicate pleasure, which is one of the highest order, for it involved noble, exalted, and universal feelings. So the poet's aim was to improve the scheme of man's existence and recast the world. The poet's aim is what? To improve the scheme of man's existence and recast the world. Okay, and my dear students, that's all for today. And I mentioned earlier, that is in our next class we will read appendix of the Preface to the Lyrical Ballads 1802. And now it's time to give you homework. Get ready to take homework. Today I will give you a question. Okay, write down the question please. It's your homework. Consider Preface to the Lyrical Ballads to show that the important thing in Wordsworth is the emphasis on the individualism of the poet. I am repeating the question. Consider Preface to the Lyrical Ballads to show that the important thing in Wordsworth is the emphasis on the individualism of the poet. That's all, my dear students, now today. See you again in our next class, inshallah. Hope all of you will do your homework. Then see you again in our next class. Till then, goodbye. Allah Hafiz.